Carl Walker there. David Cameron is planning what he calls more intensive action to help children in care in England. He's also promising better support for those leaving care. The new law would also encourage the permanent adoption of children even when it overrides family ties. The moves will be outlined in the Queen's speech on Wednesday. Ian Watson reports.
The Prime Minister is keen to demonstrate that his current focus on the EU referendum isn't at the expense of the domestic political agenda. At his party conference last year, he promised an all-out assault on poverty, so he's likely to be judged on whether this week's Queen's speech will transform his rhetoric into reality. In an article for the Sunday Times, David Cameron is associating himself with one issue in particular: improving opportunities for children in care and for those leaving care. He'll promise that they'll have a mentor until the age of 25, that social workers will be better regulated, and that he'll tip the balance of the system towards enabling children to be adopted permanently. Labour says cuts in support for students and working families have already harmed life chances. Ian Watson, BBC News.
And with me now is Andy Elvin, who's the Chief Executive of TACT, the Adolescent and Children's Trust, which is the UK's largest fostering and adoption charity. Good to see you.
Hello.
The Prime Minister clearly wants to do something to help. Have you looked at the detail and how much do you go along with here?
We've been involved in the consultation process about the bill, and actually it's very good things are coming out. The problem is that, as ever, whenever there's an announcement about this kind of thing, the Prime Minister almost seems incapable of not talking about adoption and saying it will increase adoptions. It's not his choice, it's not his call to make. What they're doing is making sure that the evidence that local authorities take to court to argue for their care plan for any particular child has a much higher evidential threshold than currently is the case. And that's been the problem, that the assessments of some relatives haven't been good enough. The assessments that are being done about very long-term decisions for children haven't been good enough. This bill will fix that, and that is a very good thing. Whether it leads to more adoptions or not is entirely in the hands of the family courts and the local authorities. Adoption isn't the best for every child. 75% of children in the care system are in foster care, and that's where we'd like to see a lot of the attention paid.
Right, so what would you say? 2 cheers, 1.5 cheers out of 3?
I think 2 cheers out of 3. They've done well. Most of the legislation is good. It's just the announcement is very skewed towards something that actually the legislation isn't going to do.
It certainly is, because listening to that and what we were being told, at least, without looking at the detail, which you know much better than I do, is that it will make adoption easier. But you're saying, obviously, the system has to go through the judicial process.
Precisely. For any given child, you've got a number of options. Ideally, you want to stay with the birth family and with the parents. If that's not possible, you then look at extended family members and relatives. That may not be possible. Then you have adoption and foster care and residential care. In each given case, there will be a different good outcome for each child. You can't prejudge which will be the best. And therefore, that's the job of the court proceedings. What this will do is mean that the evidence before those courts is better, which is a good thing.
Right, and so they can make up their minds on the basis of more evidence, more reliable evidence and so on, which would be a good...
It's an enormous decision. You're making a decision for the rest of that child's childhood and the rest of their lives. You've got to do it. Best evidence available.
Is there any problem with adoption itself in terms of not enough adopters, not enough children? I mean, how does that work out, that balance?
Well, at the moment, the balance is very skewed towards too many adopters and not enough children available for adoption, because the government has spent the last 2 or 3 years funding agencies to get more adopters ready, and at the same time the family courts have readjusted what they do, and they're granting less adoption orders, and local authorities are asking for less adoption orders. And a lot of that has to do with the impact of European law on the family courts in this country, because the UK is somewhat out of step in that we're one of the few European countries that has non-consensual adoption. A lot of our European neighbours don't do this, and I think the judiciary think we're a little bit out of step, and there's been a rebalancing of that over the last few years. So there are plenty of adopters out there, and any child going forward for adoption should have a choice of adopters to go to.
So, to sum this up, you look forward to the Queen's speech with anticipation, but how it actually works in practice, we'll have to come back to you on that.
Absolutely.
All right, Andy, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Andy Elvin there from TACT.